Your son has returned. I bring the destruction of Olympus!
People have been asking me to do this ever since I made videos on the newer God of War games. If you're unfamiliar with my journey with this series, essentially my very first experience with God of War was when the 2018 game had first come out, and I heard all the hype, amazing scores, and I even saw some gameplay. I thought the general concept and idea was so cool, and God of War was always one of those series I heard about but never played, for a multitude of reasons. One, I was still a youngster back when these games came out, and they may have been a tad bit violent for an innocent soul such as mine. Also, my love for single-player games specifically didn't develop until like a year or so before I started this channel, but of course now I've done videos on both God of War 2018 and more recently Ragnarok. So yes, I decided it was finally time to experience where this series all began. And man, if there's something I learned by playing God of War games, it's that this series does not miss. Seriously, for a series to have as many games as it does and keep a consistently very high quality across multiple eras of video games, that deserves a big round of applause for the people who stuck with this franchise all these years. And for David Jaffe, who came up with this incredibly intriguing idea for a video game series. Jaffe loved the idea of having some big adventure. Raiders of the Lost Ark was one of his inspirations when creating the original game. That and his love for Greek mythology and all the violence and bloodshed it brings that was very popular in action games. And funnily enough, Kratos' white skin came about because the artist who was drawing him had used primer before coloring in his skin, and David Jaffe liked the look of it so much that he decided to create an entire story around how this character came to have white skin. And from there, Kratos was born, and his path of vengeance started with the God of War Ares in the first game, and eventually Zeus and the gods of Olympus themselves. Just what an awesome concept for a story. Now before we get into these games more, I need a minute to appreciate these games' soundtracks. I completely gushed over Bear McCreary's soundtrack for God of War 2018 and Ragnarok. Ragnarok, of course, just won Best Soundtrack at the Game Awards, and the music in that game added so much to the emotion and overall experience, I just couldn't get enough of it. And then I booted up the original God of War for the very first time. Man, this series, I don't know how they do it, but they get literal gods to work on these soundtracks. A large portion of the God of War Trilogy's music was composed by Gerard Marino, and the music fits so perfectly with the tones of these games. The third game soundtrack specifically was the most hyped thing ever. You already know when the Rage of Sparta starts playing, a god is about to be brutally murdered. I mean, you know the main character's a menace when you have the choir singing his name. But the music in all the games is just mwah. I love how the music feels a lot more aggressive and dark. It fits with Kratos' character so well, and then the newer games' soundtracks feels a little bit more soulful and calming, but still with those hints of badassery. Again, really capturing the tone of those games and Kratos' change as a character. Both eras of God of War have perfectly fitting music for the respective games and stories. Now, Now, going into this trilogy, one of the most common criticisms I hear is that some people have an issue with Kratos. They think he's one-dimensional, too unlikable, and just an angry guy who kills things. And let me tell you, that is some baloney. I definitely notice these games don't focus as much on the story, especially when compared to the newer ones, but what is there is so good, and a lot of that comes from Kratos and his story. He's an anti-hero through and through, and I love that. I'm just gonna say it, I'm sick of always playing as the good guy, or these super nice, friendly main characters. Imagine being nice. That's so boring. I'm joking, of course, there's some great protagonists like that, but the anti-hero is 1000% my favorite type of protagonist. They're almost always so much more intriguing to me, getting to debate if what they're doing is morally correct or not, and breaking tons of predictability or stereotypes you see so often in storytelling with main characters, especially in video games. I love characters like Joel Miller, Arthur Morgan, Jason Brody, even going outside of video game characters like Eren Yeager or Walter White, both of which are some of my favorite protagonists in any medium.
I am the danger.
Those characters do some morally questionable things, to say the least, and can be downright evil sometimes, but you still root for them. It's such an interesting and strange feeling, and Kratos fits perfectly there for me. In the first game, you slowly unravel his backstory and why he wishes to erase the memories of his past. He killed his own wife and daughter in a fury after being tricked by the God of War Ares. Their ashes were bound to his skin, turning white, having to live with the guilt and pain of his actions for the rest of his days. A Spartan general so obsessed with power that it came at the cost of everything. I don't know about you, but that is such an interesting character to me. And these games never try to redeem him or make you believe he's a good person. No, Kratos does some messed up stuff in these three games. I mean, what about the poor ship captain from the beginning of God of War 1? Kratos kills the man for absolutely no reason, and then killing him becomes a running joke in the series.
Thank you! Thank the gods you came back for me!
I didn't come back for you.
No!
There is a task left for me above. I will see it completed.
You again? No, not you again!
It's not just him either. Kratos kills so many innocent people in his path of vengeance, and yet you still can't help but root for him to succeed. That's the kind of dilemma I love with characters like this. Not to mention, he's an absolute badass. Why wouldn't you want to play as this guy? And in terms of the criticism of him being one-dimensional, I don't agree with that. The games don't spend a ton of time exploring Kratos too deeply as a character. That's something the newer games have done to perfection, but that depth is still most certainly there. There's such a rich subtext to this character between his backstory and the constant guilt and shame he suffers throughout the games, his rage and deep hatred for the gods of Olympus and his father Zeus, and the new God of War games explored that side to Kratos that you can tell was always there, especially towards the end of God of War 3 and the bond he creates with Pandora. Kratos has quickly become one of my favorite protagonists in video games, and I can't believe some people were sick of him after these original games. The entire story throughout these three games, while not always the most prevalent part of the games, was very good in its limited time. The first game is all about Kratos working for the gods of Olympus, so that in return they will forgive him of his sins and erase his nightmares of killing his family. The plot is very simple. He needs to kill the God of War Ares and save Athens, but even with such little time actually spent on the story, it's still thoroughly engaging. Kratos in the end kills Ares and gets his revenge, but he's then told by Athena that it's impossible to erase his nightmares and that he must live with it. A defeated and abandoned Kratos casts himself off a cliff, hoping for the nightmares to finally stop, but the gods of Olympus still have use of him, so they stop him from falling to his death and grant him the seat as the new god of war. This whole final act and ending gave me goosebumps, such a chilling moment, and seeing Kratos sit on that throne was awesome. Then in God of War 2, Kratos, relishing in his new power, goes on a rampage, destroying cities in the name of Sparta and causing more death and destruction than Ares was ever capable of. So to stop Kratos' rampage, Zeus kills the god of war, which death is actually just a minor inconvenience for Kratos, as he's rescued by the Titan Gaia and escapes Hades to seek out the Sisters of Fate and travel back in time to kill Zeus and save his own life. Now, I'm an absolute sucker for time travel, so I loved this storyline, going after the Sisters of Fate and going back in time to the start of the game. I thought that was so cool. Again, another very simple plot and goal to work towards, but it just works remarkably well. There's definitely some plot holes which are very common when a story involves time travel. Like if the sisters wanted to go back into the past to kill Kratos, why would they bring him with them, giving him a chance to save himself? I guess you could chalk that up to them being overconfident, but if you think about it too much, you're sure to find some holes in the logic of these games. Once he kills the Sisters of Fate, Kratos basically has control over time itself, where he goes back to the start of the game and fights Zeus in a final confrontation. However, just as Kratos goes to deliver the killing blow to the king of the gods, Athena steps in front of his blade, sacrificing herself to save Olympus. The only person left who it seems actually cared about Kratos ends up being killed once again in his path of rage and vengeance. And as Athena dies, she reveals that Zeus is Kratos' father. An enraged Kratos swears to destroy Zeus and the gods of Olympus, where he then goes back in time to the Great War, brings the Titans and Gaia into the present, and climbs up Mount Olympus, bringing war to Zeus's doorstep. This action-heavy, insane finale is left on a total cliffhanger. Again, the ending was so hype, and it left me so excited to jump into God of War 3, which picks up mere seconds after the end of the second game. Now, I really enjoyed my time with all three of these games, but God of War 3 felt like a totally different level from the previous two. It was easily my favorite of this trilogy. I said in my God of War Ragnarok video that it had one of my favorite openings of any video game, and I think God of War 3's opening surpasses that for me. Picking up right where we left off at the end of God of War 2, with Kratos and the Titans climbing Mount Olympus to square off against Zeus and the gods. It is so unbelievably hype, with these incredible looking action set pieces to start, and the opening boss fight with Poseidon, which was, not to sound corny here, but so epic. Kratos makes light work of the god of the sea as he brutally kills him in this awesome first-person angle from Poseidon's eyes, letting you see just how scary and badass Kratos really is. Poseidon's death causes the Greek world to flood and drown in the sea, killing thousands, if not more, innocent people and civilians, and Kratos doesn't really seem to mind. All that matters to him now is his revenge. To him, nothing will stand in the way of his vengeance. Again, in God of War 3, the stakes feel so much higher. It feels like this is all what the previous games have been building towards, and it does not disappoint. Gaia and Kratos are struck down by Zeus because, well, this is the beginning of the game, and we can't have that rematch just yet. Kratos then falls into Hades, where he finds Athena's soul, who suddenly now in death wants to aid Kratos in his vengeance and kills Zeus. The story then continues as Kratos savagely kills the gods of Olympus one by one, taking their weapons and gear as he goes, hoping to use the power from the flame of Olympus to defeat Zeus. However, to use the power, he needs to sacrifice the girl Pandora, and Kratos' bond with this character is one of my favorite parts from the story. Initially, when they first meet in Hades, Kratos confuses the girl for his own daughter Calliope, which is why Kratos was so quick to grow attached to Pandora. Throughout this entire journey, you hadn't seen Kratos truly care about anyone to the point where he would go out of his way to protect them, except for maybe his Spartan brothers. So seeing Kratos, who has abandoned all hope and runs on nothing but rage and hatred, interacting with this very positive, upbeat girl was really great to see. It created such a nice contrast. It sort of reminded me of the relationship with him and Atreus in the newer games, but on a smaller scale. It's the first time we really see Kratos in these original games soften up a little bit and lets you know that there is this gentler, caring side to the character is just buried very deep down. This was also the first time you got to play with a companion in these original games, and I enjoyed the company for one. It gets lonely taking on all these gods and enemies by yourself, and sure, sometimes Pandora can be a little annoying in these sections. Still no Ashley from Resident Evil 4. But overall, her character I felt really helped flesh out Kratos in God of War 3. My only complaint is, I wish she was in the game longer. Since she's brought in pretty late into the story, I think if they spent a little more time building that bond between her and Kratos, it would have made what happens at the end hit a lot harder. But as Pandora goes to sacrifice herself so that Kratos can open Pandora's box and claim its power, Kratos stops her, trying to convince her they can find another way. This is the first time you see Kratos actually try to save someone when he could have gotten power. All throughout these games, you see him sacrifice innocent people for power or just to advance in an area. I mean, he crushed this poor guy's head just because he was in the way. He saved this woman just so he could use her corpse to keep a door open.
Oopsies.
So seeing him be protective of Pandora and wishing to save her showed some development. I think she really reminded him of his own daughter and not wanting to repeat the failures of his past. That is, until this big jerk shows up and insults Kratos. So in a rage, Kratos releases Pandora into the flame and attacks Zeus. And in the box, what does he get for Pandora's sacrifice? Nothing. Kratos and Zeus then duke it out near Gaia's heart, where it finally appears Kratos has killed Zeus. But just as he goes to retrieve his blade, Zeus's spirit leaves his body and attacks Kratos. Kratos then goes through a journey in his psyche, reliving all of his past failures, where thanks to Pandora, he's finally able to forgive himself for all the wrong he has done, or at least for the moment. This was a very emotional moment, seeing the perspective of his wife and daughter as they were killed by Kratos. This is really where you can see the change in him, as he regains hope and therefore his powers of a god, as he fights Zeus's spirit in this awesome first-person perspective and then beats him to death with his own fists, finally getting his revenge. The way this was done was brilliant, having us mash the circle button as Kratos wails on Zeus, as the screen goes completely red with his blood, giving us as players the satisfaction of finally bringing him down and making it feel like we're right there with Kratos punching him to death. I don't know about you guys, but I didn't realize for a while that you can mash circle infinitely, and it doesn't stop until you do. So here I was just mashing circle and beating up Zeus for like 2 minutes straight. My fingers were about to fall off from exhaustion, but that's not important. But what's sort of cool about that is you can, to a degree, understand how tiring it is for Kratos, as he also just repeatedly punches Zeus. I thought it was smart how they did that, because with all the crazy, over-the-top ways you killed the other gods, Zeus's death had to be satisfying, and it certainly was. After Kratos kills Zeus, he witnesses the destruction he brought to the mortals of the Greek world, as it stands in complete ruin without the gods of Olympus. Athena reappears, demanding that Kratos return the power he took from Pandora's box so she can rule Greece. And that's when it's revealed that Kratos had the power all along, ever since he opened Pandora's box at the end of God of War 1. The evils from the box infected and corrupted the gods of Olympus, while Kratos had received hope that Athena put into the box. However, he couldn't access it until now because of his guilt over his past. And thanks to Pandora, he was able to overcome that. Kratos, knowing he can never atone for what he's done to the people of Greece, once again attempts to end himself by stabbing himself with the blade of Olympus and spreading the power of hope to the mortals in Greece. The game ends with Kratos falling to the ground on death's door and Athena leaving with nothing. And in the post-credit scene, you can see a trail of blood off into the distance, implying Kratos has once again survived his own attempt to take his life and that he must forever live with his actions. And as we know, Kratos cannot die by his own hands, courtesy of the curse the gods bestowed upon him in the first game. A phenomenal finale to this trilogy, and finally at the end, a chance for Kratos to grow and change as a person in the future, which he of course does in God of War 2018 and Ragnarok. So playing this game and witnessing this ending makes his journey and development in those games all the more emotionally satisfying. I know the key being related to the power of hope sounds sort of cheesy, but it was a perfect way to tie a bow on the Greek era of Kratos. Also, it must be said, the voice acting across these three games is very good, especially considering the game's ages and how far we've come in terms of performances in video games. I absolutely love Christopher Judge as Kratos in the new games, as the older version of Kratos, and I also really liked T.C. Carson as the younger, angrier Kratos. His voice works so well with the younger version of the character, and Judge's works so well for the older version. Usually it bothers me when a role is recast in voice acting, especially for the main character, but it was done so seamlessly that it actually works to the character's advantage, having two great voice actors portray different versions of the character. I was sad to see T.C. Carson wasn't actually informed that he was being replaced as Kratos. It kinda sucks that after all the years he dedicated to the games and Kratos as a character, that they would just silently move on without him, but he was great in these games. Corey Burton as Zeus was also a standout. I know him as Count Dooku from Clone Wars. Funnily enough, T.C. Carson is Mace Windu's voice in Clone Wars as well, so they have a little God of War crossover there, which is pretty cool. But just in general, the performances really sold these characters and the story, and did great considering the technology of the time. I'm curious to see what exactly these games would look like if Santa Monica ever decides to do a remake, but I thoroughly enjoyed this trilogy story. It really makes me wish there was more focus on it, but the games are each around 10 to 12 hours, so there wasn't a ton of time for story and cutscenes. But like I said, what was there was very good. It makes the continuation of Kratos' story in the latter games so wonderful. The old God of War games are all hack and slash, which was actually really refreshing to me. I sort of feel like hack and slash single player games are becoming more of a dying breed, especially with the oversaturation in the open world genre. And getting to play an old school action adventure hack and slash like this felt oddly nostalgic to me. Even though I didn't play these games before, I always really enjoyed games like this. Castle Crashers was like one of the first games I got super addicted to in my childhood, so this brought a little bit of those vibes back, even if they're still drastically different games. I had a blast with the combat in this game. The Blades of Chaos are so fun to use. You get them right off the rip at the start of God of War 1. You get some basic combos, a light and heavy attack, along with a dodge, block, and a grab button where you can perform brutal finishers or rip enemies in half. The first game set a great foundation, and it was only improved upon from there in God of Wars 2 and 3. In each game, you get new weapons as you progress through the games. In God of War 1, you only got the Blade of Artemis, but in God of War 2, you get multiple new weapons, and in God of War 3, well, you get a whole bunch. I usually really enjoyed using the other weapons, but the Blades of Chaos were so fun for me, and by God of War 3, I was so familiar and comfortable with the combos, especially since I played all these games back to back, that I often really didn't need to use the alternative weapons, as fun as they were. I also love that in God of War 2 you unlock a pauldron to allow for powerful counterattacks after a successful parry, and along with the weapons you get powers as well, which differ in each game. In the first two God of Wars, you get 4 unique powers you can quickly switch between, while in God of War 3, each weapon had its own unique power, and on top of that, you got an item bar where you could use a bow, the boots of Hermes, and the head of Helios, which is just awesome. I mean, come on, what other game uses a guy's head as a flashlight? There's of course the Rage meter as well, which has different names in each game, but is basically a way to unleash devastating attacks without taking as much damage or having your combos be interrupted. Every weapon and power in these games is upgradable with red orbs you collect by killing enemies or opening chests. The progression is very simple and straightforward, using the orbs to upgrade, which unlocks new combos and special moves. The progression was very satisfying. Although in the first game it took ages to upgrade with orbs, luckily they sped up that process in the other two. The combat in these games also strikes such a nice balance of making you feel powerful and badass with these super awesome brutal finishers while still being challenging. These games could be pretty hard sometimes, and I think that's just a thing with old games in general. Since games were shorter back then, difficulty is one of the ways the developers could increase the playtime of their games. Not only that, but dying in these games also creates a learning curve. It forces you to learn the game's mechanics, the enemy's movements, and the timing of their attacks. It really forces you to stay engaged with the game, and it feels all the more satisfying when you finally clear an area you've been stuck on for ages. I definitely struggled the most in the first game. I don't know if that's because it was genuinely harder or because I hadn't fully learned the mechanics yet, probably both. But the checkpoints in the first game are a lot more unforgiving than the other two, which could be a little frustrating, I'm not gonna lie, but I still enjoyed the challenge for the most part, which is something that has kind of been lost in modern single player games. I mean, aside from the Souls games, of course, most AAA games have become easy compared to the older ones. Even in God of War Ragnarok, the checkpoints and bosses are super forgiving, even getting checkpoints in different stages of a boss fight itself. Sure, you have a lot less frustrating moments that way, but you also kind of lose that loop of learning, adapting, and finally overcoming an extremely difficult challenge, which is a big reason why so many people love the Souls games. Death is part of the experience. And don't get me wrong, the newer games have their harder moments as well. I'll never forget my reaction when I finally beat the Valkyrie Queen. I literally devolved into a caveman just screaming and beating my chest. What a feeling that was. But generally, these God of War games felt a lot more challenging even on normal difficulty, and it was pretty great actually. There's also some massive enemy variety. Even in the first game, there's a good mix of enemies with different designs, movesets, and quirks. The Gorgon is going on my list for some of the most annoying enemy types I've faced in video games, right up there with the clickers from The Last of Us. But that made ripping its head off all the more satisfying. But once again, more variety and unique enemies were introduced as the series progressed into God of War 2, and especially in God of War 3. And of course, the boss fights are just awesome. Starting with the very first boss with the water serpent in the first game that's now ingrained into my memory. And that final boss with Ares where Kratos becomes huge and the rest of the environment looks teeny tiny. Such a standout moment. The first game definitely didn't have as many bosses as 2 and 3, but they were still really fun. God of War 2 really turned it up another notch with the boss fights, which I absolutely loved, and that whole final act fighting the Sisters of Fate as you move throughout time, even seeing the Ares final boss from the first game. Like I said, I love time travel, so that was really cool to me. And then of course, the pretty challenging multi-phase boss with Zeus at the end was super intense. Almost all of the boss fights in God of War 3 blow the others out of the water though. Just from a visual and scale standpoint alone, it felt like a massive level up from the previous games. The Poseidon opening boss, Hades, and the Kronos boss looked absolutely incredible in terms of just pure scale and crazy over-the-top action. Some of the bosses may have felt a little easy and underwhelming, like with Helios and Hermes, but that was sort of the point. I mean, all Hermes was capable of doing was running, so he didn't put up much of a fight at all once he started slowing down. And Helios, that was more of an execution than a boss fight. The Hercules boss fight was pretty fun, and once again, the game ends with this crazy multi-phase boss fight with Zeus, which was so long and unbelievably hyped. I love that after just constantly beating on Zeus, he wouldn't go down, and just when you think you finally got him, another phase starts. He's the one you've been working towards these past 2 games, so this boss had to be the most intense and climactic yet, and it absolutely delivered. It was challenging, suspenseful, and had so much weight and story behind it. I loved it. A lot of bosses also include a series of quick time events and button mashing. I know some people aren't a fan of the heavy involvement of QTEs, and you don't see them as often in modern games, although the new God of War games still have a fair amount of them, and the way they were implemented in these older God of War games was for the most part really good. It made you feel more engaged with the action and constantly on your toes. Sure, it was a little frustrating when a QTE pops up and disappears too quickly and you miss it and have to restart the whole sequence. There was also a couple sections where you had to mash a certain button, usually circle, to either finish an enemy or interact with something in the level. In the first game specifically, a lot of enemies required you to button mash circle really quickly to finish them off, and that got really repetitive and annoying when you're doing it so many times back to back. My fingers got so tired from those, but the QTEs were certainly made a little easier and less tiring in the next 2 games. However, there was this one part in God of War 2 where you have to mash circle to manually move this elevator thing, and it was so exhausting. And then I failed it multiple times, and so I had to keep doing it back to back, and it got really frustrating and exhausting, stuck in an endless loop of button mashing, and I thought I'd never get it, but I finally did. Like, come on, man. I don't play video games for the exercise. Part of what I love about the God of War series, and this trilogy particularly, is it feels like the ultimate power fantasy. These games make you feel like such a badass, whether it's with the finishers, the insane set pieces and QTEs, or the massive bosses you take down. It's so hype and gives you such a strong feeling of power. God of War 3 especially, you get to slaughter an entire pantheon of gods one by one in some brutal ways. There's not many other game series out there that make you feel quite as strong and badass as God of War does, and God of War 3 was the peak of that for me. The environments across every single God of War game I've played have been stunning. But what I love about the environments in God of War specifically is the sense of scale. Across all the games, you have so many areas where there's something massive moving around in the backdrop, while you're moving in real time as tiny Kratos in comparison. In the first game, you see this with Ares in the city of Athens, and it just looks incredible. I can't believe a 17-year-old game was able to pull that off. You spend a large portion in Pandora's temple on Kronos' back, which is such a cool location and idea. Having this entire temple and environment on the back of a moving titan in the desert. The creativity with some of these environments is so unique, and something these original God of War games did especially well. There's great variety too, with so many differing locations to trudge through, from the war-torn Athens to Pandora's temple, and even the red of Hades. In God of War 2, there's even more unique and varied environments with some massive things in the backdrop. The hippocampi, all the different titans you encounter on your journey, the opening in that massive battle with Athena and Zeus. Same with God of War 3, that continues to push the envelope with these massively scaled environments. You return to Hades, although it looks a lot different from the first game. You get to see the city of Olympus, or what's left of it. There's this massive contraption with the labyrinth, and you finish the game on this beautiful sight from the top of Mount Olympus. Never has the end of the world looked so beautiful. All of the games have a lot of sections where you need to climb on a wall or across a rope of some sort. In the first game, I found these sections to be a little annoying and tedious because enemies would just keep grabbing onto me and I could hardly move. In God of War 2, these sections were improved and sped up a little bit, using the Blades of Chaos to climb. And just like most everything else, God of War 3 improved even further and made made these sections more engaging and less tedious with more action, set pieces, and moves you could do. It even incorporated it into some boss fights, which I thought looked pretty great. Of course, the older God of War games go with a fixed camera angle that switches as you move through its environments, unlike the over-the-shoulder camera in the newer games, and that's more standard in games these days. Now there's some pros and cons to the fixed camera compared to the over-the-shoulder. For one, the fixed camera allows for a much bigger sense of scale. The camera pulls back a lot to show you just how massive the area around you is, while Kratos is just a tiny speck on the screen. This looks especially awesome when you're battling a massive boss. However, in the first game specifically, this is something that improves in 2 and 3, the camera can sometimes make it hard to gauge where you are relative to everything else. For example, there's lots of sections where you need to tightrope across a gap or do some platforming, and the fixed camera can at times make it hard to judge which direction you need to go or how far to jump. It screwed me up a couple of times and could be a bit frustrating. I think the sequels do a better job of moving the camera around and having it be a lot more dynamic instead of always static in one place and making harsh cuts to the next angle. God of War 3 I thought did this really well with its constant pushing in on Kratos and pulling back for those awesome cinematic moments. The fixed camera, while not always perfect, sets up these beautiful wide shots that give a really exhilarating feel. So at the end of the day, it's a trade-off. I can't really say I prefer either because both work and have their advantages and disadvantages. Puzzles are a big part of the God of War formula. The puzzles in the original God of War were by far the most challenging out of the original 3 for me. Again, I think the puzzles were meant to be harder by design, and I'm already not the best at them, so I got stuck quite a lot in this game. These games really made me feel stupid on occasion because I'd often totally overthink the puzzles when it actually ends up being really simple or obvious to solve. They are definitely more challenging than the newer God of War games, and I enjoyed them for the most part. There were some frustrating ones, but it makes it all the more satisfying when you finally complete a puzzle you had been stuck on for ages. I for sure got stumped the most in the first game, only a couple of times in the second, and once in the third for like 40 minutes because I couldn't figure out how to line up this puzzle, and my pride wouldn't allow me to look it up or get a hint, so I just wandered around trying every possible solution for a good 40 minutes. And there's all types of puzzles in these games, most of which involve having to push an object into the right position. The third game allowed you to actually rotate the object, which I thought was a nice little change and made things less of a headache. There's also lots of platforming involved, which again could be a bit challenging. Oh my lord, don't even get me started with that one part in Hades from the first game. Oh my god, yes! Yes, I did it! Oh my god, there's another one. Like I said earlier, the fixed camera angle sometimes made the platforming a lot more difficult because you can't tell how or where you need to jump exactly, or sometimes something will be just off screen, so you can't even see where you're supposed to go. Again, I struggled with this the most in the first game, and the checkpoints aren't as forgiving as I previously stated, so repeating entire sections was frustrating. The second game made numerous improvements to the platforming. It implemented your blades into the platforming and parkour a lot more. You could use them to swing across gaps, climb walls, or even on ceilings. Kratos even steals the wings of Icarus later into the game, so you can fly as well. I guess he does that now.
Okay, so let me get this straight. I'm somewhere that's not what I would call Earth. I'm seeing freaking dragons. I just move shit with my freaking mind! Yeah, okay, that is something I do now. I do magic. Kill jacked up beasts, I'll probably fly next.
Oh, they fly now! They fly now? They fly now!
There weren't tons of changes to the platforming in God of War 3, but there really didn't need to be any. And I like how the changes and new additions from God of War 2 carried over, even those majestic wings of Icarus. That actually ends up having plot implications as well when you run into Icarus's father later in the game. Now these games are by no means open world or even semi-open world like the newer ones, but they do still allow for a small amount of exploration. If you look around in each area, you'll usually find a a little hidden area with some red orb and upgrade chests. A lot of the times it'll be tucked away just out of view of the camera, so you really have to look around to be thorough. It's a small thing, but I like how you're rewarded for checking the nooks and crannies and exploring every area as much as you can. And it's finally time to talk about how these games hold up graphically speaking. So the only way you can play God of Wars 1 and 2 are either on old consoles, a PC emulator, or through PS Now on your PlayStation 4 or 5. I played through PS Now, which I haven't been a big fan of in the past because all the games are played in their original resolution and you need a constant internet connection to play. However, luckily God of Wars 1 and 2 have HD versions on PS Now, so you can play the games at 720p and 60 FPS, which again obviously isn't great by today's standards, but to play the games it's worth it, and I got used to it pretty quickly. The games don't look bad at all. Obviously they haven't aged the best in terms of playing them now, but for the time I think they look pretty good, and there were still lots of impressive technical feats for a game of that time. I touched on earlier how it has these massive backdrops with some sort of creature, god, titan. It looks so amazing in that respect. And thank God these are in 60 FPS, it made the experience pretty smooth. A lot of the cutscenes are pre-rendered and they look pretty great. It is a little jarring when you see an in-engine cutscene because it looks so much worse than the pre-rendered stuff. But I honestly had a much better experience with these games than I was expecting. Aside from a few things, they've aged pretty damn well. I played on my PS5 controller and had next to no issues. Now God of War 3 of course has the benefit of a remastered version for the PS4 that was released in 2015. Now I'm sure the original game still holds up really well, but the remastered version looked so good. This is still a 7-year-old remaster of a 12-year-old game, and it held up really well. Going from God of War 2 to 3 was such a massive jump. It feels like this game had way higher budget, so many crazy set pieces and cutscenes. The overall aesthetic and design was updated, even the look of the chests and everything. It was such a massive jump, and I know I played the remastered version, but still, the leap in quality from 2 to 3 is so impressive. It obviously has held up the best out of the trilogy. Going into this trilogy, I didn't really know fully what to expect. Like, there were little things I knew from playing the new games, and I think I saw some clips a few years back, but I was so pleasantly surprised by these games. They hold up very well, even though the original, while it has its frustrations, was so good. I really miss these kinds of games, and I love the new ones of course, but these definitely deserve to be revisited. The story, while not the most prevalent part of these games, was very good. The combat was tons of fun, the bosses were just awesome, the environments and scale were beautiful. I'm so happy I decided to check out these games, and I really don't know how I would rank them compared to the newer ones. They're just so different and masterpieces in their own ways. Like I said, God of War 3 was my favorite of this trilogy, and honestly I was very addicted to the game when I was playing for this video. After finishing these 3 games, the best way I can describe them is as a collective masterpiece. Thank you for watching, everybody. This video took quite a while to put together, so I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think of the original God of War trilogy in the comments. I want to hear how you guys first experienced these games, because this is one of those series where a lot of people have some fond, nostalgic memories, whether it's from childhood or playing them during a tough time in your life. It's always really cool to hear the different stories of when and how people found these games. But again, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, I'd really appreciate it if you considered leaving a like and subscribing to the channel if you're new. Big thank you to all my members for supporting me. If you'd like to join, the link is in the description. Other than that, thanks for watching and have a great rest of your day, everybody.